Hi, my name is Sage Foley and I'm a designer and seamstress that works in film, fashion, and theater. Have you ever been watching a movie and you see an item of clothing that you just have to have, something you need in your closet? For some people, it might be a princess dress. For other people, it might be a superhero costume. For me, it was a very specific jacket from the 2011 movie Monte Carlo starring Selena Gomez. This jacket. Even from the young age of 14 when I saw this movie in theaters, I remember seeing that jacket and being amazed by it. The fact that the pearls held the top pieces to the bottom pieces I thought was incredible, and I'd never seen anything like it. And since then, that jacket has been on my mind. So I thought that the first piece of clothing I remember ever wanting from a movie would make the perfect first making of video on my YouTube channel. Even though I've gotten older and obviously my taste in clothing has changed, I'm still enamored with this jacket. The floating panels held together by the pearls is truly a feat of tailoring, and I wanted to see if I could accomplish it. All projects start with a sketch and then a full rendering. This is when I also start working out the order of operations I'm going to use when I start stitching this garment together. I knew my goal wasn't a direct replica of this piece. This isn't a cosplay type of situation. I wanted to take inspiration from this piece and design my own work. I want my final piece to nod to this garment, and in the end, I ended up making mine a little more Chanel in the 80s inspired. Going off the spirit of my last video, I decided to use the Denick bodice sloper as the base for this jacket and draft from there. This is also when I started laying out the edges that the pearls were going to hold together. From here on out, I'll be calling them the pearl edges. It gave me a chance to work out how I wanted them to look going across the body, down the back, where I wanted them height-wise. I had to measure the size of the pearls to get the correct spacing here and make sure that it didn't throw the balance of the rest of the draft off. I ended up transferring all of the dart shaping into princess seams. In a very traditional jacket style, my back dart seams go into the armscye, and that will also help prevent gaping at the back. Next, I did the mock-up. Mock-ups, in my opinion, are truly one of the most important steps of the process. They really help you see what your final piece will look like, and they make sure you don't waste any of your final fashion fabric by cutting out an ill-fitting garment. You can see that I don't have the edges cut that the pearls will hold together in the final garment. This is because I'm truly using this mock-up to test fit. I'm not using it to see how it will make the rest of the garment hang. I could have done this as a test, but between muslin being so different from my fashion fabric and the fact that I knew I was going to have support layers in the final garment, I thought it wouldn't really be all that enlightening in this stage to separate it, and I knew it would be much easier and faster to construct if I just constructed it as a whole piece and just marked out these style lines on my mock-up. Next, the cutting stage. This stage actually took me a lot longer than I thought it would because I only had 1 yard of fabric. I bought this fabric before I knew anything about sewing, but I did buy it with this project in mind because, like I said, I've always wanted to do this project. And so I love the fabric that I bought, but I definitely underbought, especially because I would have liked to pattern match a little bit more, and Baby Sage wasn't aware of pattern matching or what it took to pattern match. You definitely need more fabric to pattern match because it gives you room to play with the bias and the grain and make sure that everything is lined up properly. Unfortunately, I didn't have that luxury in this piece to perfectly pattern match because I had such little fabric, but I did my best. I think I lined it up pretty good. I definitely didn't want the pattern to be so off kilter that it was distracting, but luckily this is a pretty busy pattern, so I thought it wouldn't make a huge difference in the end. With that being said though, I did cut very, very carefully, and I only cut one piece at a time when usually I have my fabric folded and I cut 2 layers at a time. Because tweed has a very loose weave, it's very slubby, which means that it moves and warps a lot when you work with it. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted to attach a fusible interfacing to the wrong side of these pieces. So at this step, I also cut out my fusible interfacing, and then I used my industrial iron to press them on. I don't interface the sleeves, however, because I want the sleeves to have a lot of movement. I want them to be able to move with the arm when it bends and it reaches. I do, however, interface the sleeve cuff so that it's nice and crisp and keeps its shape. Finally, we get to the sewing process. I began by serging all of my edges. This is also a step I don't necessarily always do on every kind of fabric, but this tweed was fraying all over the place. My studio was covered with tweed dust. I wanted to serge it early on to prevent frayed edges from coming out anywhere on the right side of the garment, especially in those tight places where I knew that the edge of the sleeve was just going to be turned under and wasn't actually attached into anything. Then I put the pieces together on the machine. Next, I went in and ironed up all of the edges, the purl edges, the hem, and the sleeve cuff. At this point, I also self-faced the neckline. I like to do this on the necklines especially because I think it keeps it really clean and professional looking and keeps it very tidy. As you can see in my sewing process, I use a ton of tailor's tracing. I use a ton of tailor's thread to baste up all of my seams. I mark all of my notches with tailor's thread. I use this stuff all the time. This is my favorite method of marking because it's the only one that isn't permanent but also sticks around if you iron, but also won't ruin your garment, and you can remove it anytime you want and it won't leave a mess. Also, you can hold layers together with it. It's also a basting stitch. So I tailor stack everything. Then I had to do the arduous process of setting in the sleeves into two separate pieces. In two places on each sleeve, there's a 5/8 of an inch gap where the sleeve is just attached to nothing. This was difficult because I really had to make sure that there was a lot of balance, and I actually ended up having too much of a gap, which when I tried to attach the pearls, pulled the edges together and created gaping on the arm side. So I had to go back, take my sleeves apart, and reset them in with a smaller gap later on. This could have been avoided if I would have marked more carefully, but I just eyeballed it and trust my eyeballs, and my eyeballs were wrong, so I did have to go back. But in the end, it turned out good and well balanced. I also put in a sleeve header at this point. A sleeve header is something that's in basically every tailored jacket ever, and I make sure to put them in all of my tailored jackets, but I knew that this one would be a bit of a challenge, and it ended up being a little weird because there's just so much fabric discrepancy. On one side, I have 3 layers of fabric that the sleeve header is going into the seam of, and then where the sleeve is unattached, it's literally 1 layer of the tweed. But it didn't bother me too much, and I'm still happy I put the sleeve header in. I think it gives the shoulders a little bit more definition, especially because I knew I probably wasn't going to be able to do a shoulder pad in this garment. I tried and it came out weird, so I ended up scrapping that idea. Basically, the way that I put my sleeve headers in is by using batting, and I bind the edge of the seam allowance. I prefer this to the traditional way of putting in sleeve headers because sleeve headers also usually have a piece of fabric that hangs down into the sleeve, and I find that sometimes that piece of fabric can get like smushed up or folded over and create bumps and lumps, and so I just think that this is a really nice tidy way to do a sleeve header. I had to whip stitch the sleeve header in at the unattached parts of the sleeve so that it wouldn't show from the right side of the jacket. Now you'll see that this jacket looks like chaos. Essentially, right now, this jacket is only being held together by these 2 sleeves, so it looks really crazy. Now I have to carefully balance the right and the left side and the back and the front of the jacket by attaching the pearls. This process was definitely one of trial and error, and I had to go back and redo a few of my placements a few times to make sure that there wasn't any pulling or gaping, but I think it came out good in the end, and I'm really pleased with how it looks. Next, I used a blind hem stitch to secure all of my seam allowances down. This is good because it just is going to keep them in place, they won't move around. Because you're stitching all of these seam allowances down, you just feel the jacket solidifying, which is really cool. Now's the satisfying part of being able to remove all of the tailor's tacking as I went. I love this part of the process. It is so satisfying and it is so nice because it means you're getting close to the end. I definitely erred on the side of way too much seam allowance on this project. I was so concerned about this project fraying and like it falling apart that I used way more seam allowance than I needed to. So I ended up having to serge that down in a few places. But honestly, I would rather err on the side of too much seam allowance and be able to cut it down later than err on the side of too little seam allowance and then not have anything to work with if you need it. Then I cut out and stitched together my lining. I cut the lining out with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on every single piece. This just helped because I cut the fashion fabric using tons of different allowances, hem allowances, seam allowances, all of it. I had different measurements, I had different reasons, and it was so chaotic and kind of hard to keep track of. And so for the lining process, I just wanted it to keep it nice and easy. Also, I knew that lining this jacket was going to be working a ton on the form, working with the shapes, and doing it all by hand. So I wasn't super worried about really calculating it out and making sure it was perfect. I knew it was going to have to be a very free form process. And here you can see me putting the lining in by hand using a fell stitch. Finally, I secured the sleeve cuff lining to the sleeve using a slip stitch. And that's it, the completed jacket. I'm extremely pleased with how it came out. It's so cool and gratifying to have something that's been in your head for so long become a real, tangible object. Whenever I finish a project, I always get so excited to start the next one, and trust me when I tell you that I have so many exciting projects planned for this channel, and I can't wait for you guys to see it. But until then, you guys can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Fully Dressed for more content, and I'll see you guys soon.